Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, Research Director, Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, I welcome you all to the third Coffee House debate. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and nonpartisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Keeping in mind the same, the theme for today's discussion is Attack on the US Congress Challenges for Biden, and the speakers will throw light on the following aspects majorly. First, recent attack on the Congress, what message it gives about the American politics, how divided is American society, and how this polarization affects Biden administration. And second, what are the foreign policy challenges for Biden? The chair for today's session will be Professor Chintamani Mahapatra. Professor Chintamani Mahapatra is currently the Pro Vice Chancellor of Jawaharlal Nehru University and Professor of American Studies at the School of International Studies of JNU. He is also the editor of Indian Foreign Affairs Journal. Professor has held numerous positions for in the UGC Review Committee, Area Studies Program, Fellowship Expert Committee, and ICSSR. In addition to it, he has conducted research in several US presidential libraries and the US National Archives, British Public Record Office in London. Professor Mahapatra has authored 4 books, 1 edited volume, and has contributed chapters to above 30 edited books. He has published above 70 research articles in reputed journals and has been awarded a number of international fellowships, such as the Fulbright Fellowship, Commonwealth Fellowship, and visiting fellowships to undertake research in the US, UK, Austria, Australia, and many other countries. He has been visiting faculty in several UGC run academic staff colleges, the Foreign Service Institute of the Ministry of External Affairs, National Defense College, Army War College, etc. He's also a regular commentator in newspapers and on all audio-visual media on international affairs. We welcome you, sir. It's a pleasure to have you in our midst today. The speakers for today's session are Professor David Mednikov from the University of Massachusetts, US, Dr. Amit Gupta from the USAF Air War College, US, Professor Kirk Dorsey from the University of New Hampshire, US, Dr. Roly Lal from the Elliott School of International Affairs, US, Professor David Lubin from the American University, US, and Dr. Namrata Goswami, subject matter expert, Futures Lab, Montgomery, US. Thank you, everyone, for sparing time out for us today. We're glad to witness your presence. This is for the audience now. This session is streaming live on our Facebook page. You may like, share, and comment. Also, you may post your questions for the speakers in the chat box to be answered during the end of the session. Thank you, everyone. I now hand over the session to Professor Chintamani. Sir, the floor is all yours.
Good morning to my friends from the United States. Good afternoon and good evening to friends from other parts of the world, including South Asia. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure that I got this opportunity to chair a session where some of the panelists are so well known to me. They are my friends. Amit, I don't know whether Roli remembers me. A long time ago, I met her in Rand Corporation, of course, when I was doing a project on US approach towards the Islamic world. And Namrata, I know her because she was part of ITSA. And other 3 colleagues, first time I'm seeing you, but hope to see you again in the future. And the topic, as you know, is not only interesting and fascinating, it is also very unfortunate. Now, more than 200 years ago, there was an attack on the US Congress. And that was by an enemy country. There was a war between the US and Britain. And since then, there was no attack of the kind, the violent attack of the kind you saw today. And this time, the attack was not by any enemy country or an outside force like Al-Qaeda. It is by people from within the United States. And some people say that it was an insurrection. Some people say it was done by domestic terrorists. But the most unfortunate part of the whole incident is the American president was behind it. Apparently, he incited the people to do that, and he thanked them after it was done, the vandalism that took place in the US Congress. Another interesting unprecedented development that we saw was a Confederate flag flapping on the shoulder of one of the uh, persons who passed into the US Congress. Even during the Civil War in the US, such a thing never happened. Even the Confederate Army was not able to enter and do whatever was done in the US Congress. Right now, the country is divided, it's known to everyone. But right now, apparently, even the Republican Party is divided. So in this kind of scenario, it will be really a learning experience for me and for everybody else that people who are in the United States, some of my friends are based in Washington, D.C., and some of the friends are there in other parts of the United States. How it feels like seeing the situation from within the United States, that is something that we would like to learn. Of course, we are watching television and seeing all kinds of social network and Twitter and newspapers, etc. But you are there. So I think it is going to be a very fascinating experience in next uh, hour and a half. And all of us are going to learn more about what's going on in the USA, whether there is going to be an impeachment of the American president, second time to the same person, whether he would resign before his term comes to an end, whether he's going to be removed by invoking Amendment 25, we do not know. But all kinds of things are happening. The things are happening right now. The events are unfolding. It's a dynamic situation. Even then, there are a lot of things to discuss. What are going to be the challenges for Joe Biden administration from within the country, and what are going to be the challenges from outside the country? Let us now begin the proceedings of this webinar. And let me, at the outset, request Professor David Matikoff to make his presentation.
Thanks very much. Namaste, Happy New Year. I'm pleased to participate in this coffee house along with my fellow panelists. And I just want to mention as a caveat that there was some sort of a glitch and I didn't actually get these questions, but my presentation I think will be question adjacent. Last week's occupation of the seat of lawmaking in the United States was shocking to Americans in the world. And, on a personal note, like most Americans, I'm processing this with a lot of strong and, ongoing emotions. The subtitle of today's coffee house on this attack is Challenges for Biden, but I believe the issues I'll touch on are challenges for the entire United States and to some extent the world. I write on legal and political cultures and on the US role in the world, especially with respect to the Middle East. I'll say something brief, therefore, about three particular challenges that were highlighted by last Wednesday's events. I'll both identify each challenge and suggest a way forward very briefly. These three challenges are first, the need to reinforce informal rules around democracy and law in the United States. Second, the importance of deflating right-wing militant extremism. And third, the prospect for a US role in helping democracy and law in the world, which I know are issues very near and dear to this institute. I'll start with the issue of law and democracy in the United States. Much of my academic work is on the importance of informal rules of behavior and cultural values in preserving a stable legal and political system. I believe this importance has really been demonstrated during the administration of Donald Trump. Trump's legacy has not really been to damage the formal legal and political institutions that make the American system work. Whether we look at the mechanisms around American elections, the work of courts, or the day-to-day function of political bureaucracy, formal legal and political institutions have largely, not entirely, but largely held up. In particular, the administration of the recent election and the large voter turnout last November were impressive. The problem and challenge to Biden and anyone who cares about democracy and the rule of law has been Trump's attacks on the legitimacy of the election outcome and anything that political agencies and courts did that went against his desires. Trump convinced thousands of the need for and then incited a violent attack on the US legislature by sowing doubt on the informal rule of law that requires officials and regular people to agree on the procedures and process of a transition of leadership in a democracy. In this, he connected to and helped expand a system of domestic and international authoritarian activism that uses fear, disinformation, and the appeal of power to encourage some citizens and officials in the Republican Party to mistrust and work against the clear results of a democratic election. The alarming threats that Trump and some others in the Republican Party have posed to the informal norms that uphold the formal rule of law and democratic institutions in the United States can never be entirely stopped. Indeed, a useful result of last week is to show how much laws and institutions depend on subjective ideas that are open to varied interpretation and contestation. Nonetheless, a way forward for the Biden administration on these informal legal norms is to lead in publicizing the crucial nature of leaders and ordinary citizens' understanding and appreciation of legal and political values. Biden's team can call out leaders and media figures who encourage these attacks on the rule of law and democracy, and can strengthen efforts and partnerships with educators to increase popular understanding of the multifaceted and diverse values that have shaped legal and political institutions in our country. The second challenge I want to mention is right-wing militant extremism. Please note that I am by nature open-minded to diverse political views. I appreciate both that some American leftists can say or do things with which I might disagree, and that at some point political work will have to be done for Democrats to connect to some of the over 70 million Americans who voted for Trump last year. Having said this, I would argue that in general, and especially right now, right-wing extremists are the major political threat in the United States today. With Trump's encouragement, they have grown, become bolder, and shown willingness to attack individuals and government institutions, as they have done in several American states and they did last week in Washington. Some of these extremists have strong racist and anti-foreign ideologies, which were on display in the symbols, like the Confederate flag, that they brought with them to the Capitol building last Wednesday. Biden and the US more generally can address this challenge of right-wing militant extremism in straightforward ways, but this will require time and patience. There are three basic tasks which I hope the new administration will undertake. First, law enforcement must crack down on these groups, which it has ample grounds to do based on their actions in the Capitol and elsewhere. We are already seeing this happen, and I expect that the Biden Justice Department will keep this work going. Very few people in government want future attacks like last week to happen again, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. The second task on extremism is to work against extreme right-wing militarism through pressure on Republican leaders to be clear in denouncing such militarism, as well as the lies that fuel it. Many Republicans in Congress are condemning the mob riot on Wednesday. Sadly, not enough yet have criticized the consistently false allegations around the election or the racism that fueled this mob to act. This relates to a third, harder task around right-wing extremism. This task is to work hard against the disinformation and conspiracy-minded media organizations that have allowed extremists to broaden their base and motivate their attacks. A first step here has been the suspension of Trump from Facebook and Twitter. Still, Trump is the tip of an iceberg of disinformation that groups like QAnon and the One American Network spew out. There are specific strategies that in US law and policy can regulate media without undermining American societies and the Constitution's overall commitment to robust free speech. I can talk about these in the QA, and there might be other panelists who study this more than I do. But in short, educational and institutional work to cut off right-wing extremists from organizations that broadcast lies and help them thrive will be crucial to restore civility and de-escalate conflict in the US. The third and final challenge brought up by last week's attack that I'll mention is the global role of the United States, and I'll be very brief on this. As many commentators have rightly pointed out, the incoming Biden administration's efforts to restore the United States as a force for championing global diplomacy and democracy might be undermined by the fact that our own democracy looks fragile. Doubts about American foreign policy in the past and any moral advantage the US might have had moving forward in its foreign policy were summarized nicely on Twitter Wednesday by a former student of mine, the Palestinian American activist and pundit Yusuf Munayyer. He tweeted that, quote, the US exported so much democracy that we don't have any left. The quip suggests two serious points. One is that the US claims to make advocacy and aid for democratic politics in the world a serious part of its foreign policy. But the reality of its actual policies casts doubt on this claim. Of course, during the Trump administration, the US moved away even from claims to bolster and foster democracies. A second point implied from Munayyer's quip is the harm to democracy in the US last week and in the months before makes it hard to look to Washington as any sort of desirable model for politics in other countries. I certainly believe that recent American politics have made it harder for the United States to portray itself as a model democracy for the world. The thing is, though, I have long been skeptical that American foreign policy should proceed from a position of presumed moral political superiority. Rather, the United States has not consistently stood for political values of democracy, pluralism of thought, and diversity. Because of this, the events of last week don't change, and if anything, serve to amplify how I think the US under Biden might respond to the challenge of repositioning its foreign policy. Washington can and should work to strengthen diplomatic ties among democratic countries and support political and civil rights and pluralism throughout the world. But it should not and cannot do so because the United States is better or knows better than other countries. Rather, it should do so because it understands how fragile and challenged such rights and pluralism are, as we saw on our own shores last week. Put differently, the very vulnerability that American democracy and the rule of law faced last Wednesday and under Trump generally should give President Biden and his government motivation to support democratic values globally from a position of concern, not superiority. I think that a US role in the world that works for the values it espouses through humility rather than hubris can be more effective than a pro-democracy posture grounded in moral superiority and quite often hypocrisy. So I hope that it might be possible for the recent shadows of authoritarianism in the US to end the myth of American exceptionalism, but create instead opportunities to reinforce more collaborative multilateral diplomacy based on the essentialism of democratic values. If there's time in the QA, I'd be happy to speak more specifically about Biden's policy challenges and likely responses in the Middle East, which is my region of expertise, or any of the broader points that I just brought up. But for now, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. I think that was a very insightful presentation in such a short time. You touched upon so many important issues. One point I would like to underline that most of the discourse in the mainstream newspapers, even on television, saying that Donald Trump got 70 million plus votes. Unfortunately, not many people talked about the number of votes that Hillary Clinton got last time when she was defeated in the electoral college vote. Why are the people harping on the number of supporters of only Trump? 81 million voters voted for Joe Biden, and that is not coming into the discourse. That itself influences the way you think about the issue. The major point that you highlighted, I really appreciate it, because from here also we're watching how the right-wing extremism has not only spread across the United States, it has penetrated into your intelligence department, your police department, and other kinds of law enforcement agencies. A couple of weeks ago, Germany the big news about how the similar things happening in Germany. And suddenly, when some people in the US did some research, they found out that it has penetrated so many important law enforcement agencies. It is a thing to be concerned about. So thank you very much for highlighting that particular thing. And finally, on the promotion of democracy, I entirely agree with the kind of points of view that you said. But let me also highlight this. For a long time, the Americans were preaching the world about democracy and projecting themselves as the model. But today, because of the 6th January event, there are other people who are preaching the United States. There should be peaceful transition of power. Germany and so many other countries are saying that. This is the irony of development. But thank you so much for your brilliant presentation on that. Let me move on to Dr. Amit Gupta from Airward College. Amit, now the floor is yours.
All right, can you hear me, Chintamani?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, great. Unlike David Mendikoff, I am not open-minded about the right wing in America. I'm a very proud Bernie Sanders supporter, as you can see. And I went and put on my sweatshirt because it's time people like us stood up. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is very simply two things. How did we get here and where are we headed? And how did we get here is very clear. Number one, there is a huge demographic transition taking place in the United States. By 2044, the minorities in America become the majority. And this is Census Bureau data, okay? In 2022, 50% of the children in primary school were supposed to be minorities. Guess what? That happened in 2019. And that's despite the best efforts of Trump and his BFF, Stephen Miller. They could not stop the inexorable shift towards a demographic transition. Now, the interesting thing to remember is demographic transitions have taken place, to my mind, at least in 3 countries, and in none of them did it really end well. First was Lebanon, Fiji, Trinidad and Tobago, where the minorities became the majority. In all 2 cases, you have coups, 1 case you had a civil war. Now, that's point number 1. You have rising anxiety because America doesn't look like what it used to when Dwight Eisenhower was president. 2, there is a concentration of wealth in America taking place. Joe Biden won 477 counties, but he won 7 million more votes. More importantly, he won 70% of American GDP. Donald John Trump won 2,497 counties. He won 29% of GDP, and he got 7 million less votes than Biden. This is only going to be magnified because there's been work done at the University of Virginia on this, that by 2040, 8 states have 50% of the population. And those states are the ones where you have large numbers of migrants. Those states are going to be the knowledge economy states. I can go down the list on it. So you're seeing a very clear educational divide in America. You're seeing a very clear wealth divide in America. And there is a third thing, which I think, or fourth one, which is important in understanding why it happened. And this is where I go back to my days of reading Max Weber, who I reread over the summer when we were all quarantined. Look, Trump is charismatic authority, as Weber put it. And that's why you've seen this kind of outrageous manifestation of political issues. Biden will be institutional, bureaucratic authority. He'll be boring. After 2 months, we'll be scratching our heads and saying, who's the president of the United States? But as a friend of mine put it beautifully, he said, I hope in 2021 we have tranquility. And tranquility is something which we all long for now. So this is obviously why it happened. You have a large dispossessed group of people who are becoming the proletariat and don't know what to do about it. So what do? You express anger, you express nativism. Flip this around. Where are we headed? And let me start by number one. Number one is the left now smells blood, and the left is going to seek revenge, and not revenge by rioting on the streets. You leave that to uneducated people. 2016, the left splintered and allowed Trump to become the president. 2018, the left united, took back Congress. 2020, the presidency. And 2021, Georgia just went blue. And here's what you've got to remember. The left has money. So in the Georgia elections, they spent $215 million. Warnock and what's his name? So this was never the case in a Senate election. You know this well, Chintamani, you study American politics. And you'd spend maybe 20, 30 million on a Senate race. In Obama's first election, he spent close to 800 million. So a fourth of that was spent in the state of Georgia. And Georgia doesn't have that kind of money. That came from outside. Jamie Harrison in South Carolina got $57 million. South Carolina doesn't have that kind of money. You are seeing the left sitting back and saying, we have to start enforcing certain things. Second thing that's happening is, you know, these people went and put up their escapades on Facebook and social media and whatever else they do, TikTok, I'm sure. What American companies do is when they hire you, they look at your Facebook page, they look at your social media. And when they see things like this, they get very scared. They say, we don't want to assume the legal responsibility. We don't want to assume the financial responsibility. And this guy's a nut job, and he may be having a gun and some pipe bombs or IEDs in his car when he comes to work. You're going to see a lot of these people getting fired, not because these companies have any respect for the rule of law or equality or so on. They just don't want to be sued. And, you know, the best example of this is the National Football League, which till George Floyd was killed, was not willing to take Black Lives Matter seriously, and it essentially vilified Colin Kaepernick. Today, the National Football League is a born-again racial equality organization. Third thing which is important is law enforcement is now on notice. What happened in Washington was disgraceful, but it was also showed a level of incompetence which you're not going to see elsewhere. I used to work at the Congressional Research Service. I know how difficult it is to get into the Capitol building. You have metal detectors, you have police with guns, so on. I didn't see one guy pull out a gun and fire a bullet in the air. Had that happened, that crowd may have pulled back. So really you need to put law enforcement on notice and ask them one question. Are you going to allow this to happen? Otherwise, we have police reforms. And believe me, that is one thing nobody wants. So that would be the third thing. And the fourth one, and this is to those of you who study political science. I don't. I think it's a bankrupt discipline. Let me point this out. My old professor was a guy called Hedley Bull. His co-author was a guy called Martin White. Martin White said, American political IR theory is a justification of American foreign policy. So when bipolarity was in place, it was the greatest thing ever. So Kenneth Neal Waltz told us. After unipolarity came about, Yoshihiro Francis Fukuyama, Krauthammer, all these people started talking about how wonderful unipolarity is. Now flip that around for those of you who study American domestic politics. And Chintamani, you and I remember this because we're old enough to be taught this. We were always taught the best political system is a two-party system. And all these people with 3 parties, 4 parties, 8 parties, or in India, 15-party coalitions, they just don't get it. They're so unstable, so on. I think there's a need for a real debate in the United States on what to do to the political system, how to improve the party system. Can you really bring about changes in the Constitution? And I'll say one thing here. you are seeing a lot of, at the city council level, you're seeing third parties emerge in America. In Seattle, there is an Indian American woman called Shama Sawant. She ran on a $15 minimum wage and won. First socialist elected to the Seattle City Council since 1905. When she ran a second time, Amazon gave 5 times the amount of money she'd raised to her opponent. She won again. If you look around America, city after city is going for the $15 minimum wage. Florida, which by no stretch of imagination is a liberal state, agreed to a $15 minimum wage. I think this is where the left should focus in America. Economic progress, number one. Number two, challenge all this. This is the only country where traitors are glorified. The Confederacy, you name military bases after these people, and nobody has the courage to stop it. Again, one of the things I used to study as civil wars, now I'm bored by them. I'll just say this: Nigeria had a bloody civil war, Finland had a bloody civil war, Spain had a bloody civil war, Indonesia had a bloody civil war. In none of those cases do they erect monuments to the people who waged civil wars. In none of those cases do they name military bases after civil wars. And in my town, 90% Black high schools have names like Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis. That is, and if your students don't understand this, because I'm really getting upset by the declining quality of undergraduate education in America, explain it to them this way. Would you like to go to a high school that is named the Osama bin Laden High School? So it's time for the left to stand up, and it's time for the left to use every resource it has to make sure this doesn't happen again. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amit. Uh, it's a very intellectual presentation, very insightful, a different way of looking at transformation taking place in the United States. And one point that you talked about Homeland, the law enforcement. After 9/11 attack, there was Homeland Security. And what was Homeland Security Department doing on 6th of January? About 100 plus people, 120 people who have been arrested, and some background check has been done. Most of them have been hardcore Trump supporters for quite some time. And some people grieve about the fact that why did the Capitol Police could not register them? Then they remember what happened to Black Lives Matter, and rubber bullet was used, tear gas was used, but here people could barge in, and why? And then the Maryland governor is talking about the time lag. He wanted the National Guard to come, but he was not getting the approval in time. So that's why a new kind of opinion is coming, that this was stage managed and it was intentionally done, very well devised and designed, and it had to happen, and the police could not do anything. National Guard could not do anything. They came pretty late. So I think on law enforcement and right-wing extremism that David talked about, and you talk about law enforcement, these are the wake-up calls for the United States. And just one little footnote that I would like to give to the Iyer theory. A long time ago, I was reading 2 volumes by Chilcott, where he says theories are not actually coming out of your mind out of having empirical data and building theories. Theories are manufactured to justify certain policies. Yeah. They give a lot of information on that, how most of the theories are made, unmade, defined, redefined to suit a particular purpose, a way of thinking. So thank you.
Can I just add one thing very quickly?
Please.
There's one very important shift happening in America. Black Lives Matter is being run by Black women, not Black men. And no, this is really important for one reason. The civil rights movement, you read Taylor Branch's book on it. There were lots of splits between Martin Luther King, Shuttleworth, Abernathy, Jesse Jackson, who's still around. Black women have said, we are not going to factionalize this. We have a broader purpose. And when people get united and people make a persuasive argument, it's very difficult to stop that. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Amit, for your really critical thinking on some of the key issues of the United States. Now, let me move on to Professor Kirk Dorsey to make his presentation.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. And I appreciate everybody gathering, and I've learned a great deal from the previous presenters, so thank you. So I wanted to make a few comments first on the election and the foreign policy, and I'll try to keep it brief because I know we have many speakers and good questions from the audience as well. I want to emphasize first that the election in the United States in November was a free and fair election and one of the most impressive elections that the United States has pulled off. And there's a lot of particularly pro-Trump media saying it was rigged, but the evidence is overwhelming that American citizens showed up both as voters and as volunteers. And the volunteers who count the votes, that's a thankless job. Many of us, I'm guessing, on this call who are American citizens have gone in and helped out at voting, helping people register and things like that. So this election worked. So in that sense, the democracy is functioning, and it worked in the middle of a pandemic. And the evidence that it worked and that it was not rigged is both the fact that the Trump administration and its allies have launched about 60 court cases, some of which were heard by Trump-appointed judges, and the Trump administration has lost all of them. There's been no evidence of fraud. And of course, the other important thing that needs to be kept in mind, and I think this may contradict a little bit what Professor Gupta was saying about the GDP question, is that the Biden did better than the Democratic Party as a whole. So the Republican Party actually made gains in the House of Representatives. Here in my state of New Hampshire, the Republicans took control of the state legislature. So the Republican Party didn't so much lose as Donald Trump lost. And the Republican Party actually gained. So obviously there was no fraud in the election, or else the Democrats would have had fraud all the way down the line and maintained their hold on the House and maintained their hold on the state legislatures as well. So I think that's a very important thing to remind people of, particularly people who might be thinking, well, is there fraud in this election? The United States is polarized, but I think polarization is pretty normal in a country this large with this many different interests. There's never been a presidential election where the winning candidate got more than 60% of the vote. And so that means 40% of the people didn't like Ronald Reagan or FDR and had really bad things to say about Ronald Reagan or FDR. And then there are all the people who didn't bother to vote at all. So there's been this split. And even if you look at the public approval ratings, I think in my lifetime, only twice have presidents approached 90%, and that was after 9/11, George W. Bush, and after the first Gulf War in 1990-91, his father. Every other time, presidents have generally been up and down dramatically. So what I think is really striking about the Trump administration, there are two things. One, if you look at his approval numbers, they have been in a very narrow band throughout his 4 years. The needle has barely moved. He has not had that moment where people rally around him, but nor has he had that moment where his supporters abandoned him. George W. Bush, who had the 90% approval rating, when he left office was down around 20-25%. His father had the similar thing. So there was these seismic shifts. Trump has avoided both the highs and the lows. And I think there are two things going on. One is that Trump has done something that no other president, at least in the modern system, has done, which is he has stamped out opposition within his own party. It is truly remarkable that if you in any way are seen as popping up against Trump, there is a backlash against you that makes it not worthwhile. So you see people like Senator Jeff Flake from Arizona, Crocker from Tennessee, who just said, I don't want to deal with this, and just left politics altogether rather than stand up against their incumbent president. And this is truly remarkable in American history. The other part about polarization that I think is different here is that what we have in this country now, and people have alluded to it, is an echo chamber, or maybe a pair of echo chambers around social media in particular. And so that, it used to be if you wanted to talk politics, you talk politics with your neighbors, and maybe the person across the street who disagreed with you was actually the person who helped you find your lost dog, or you shoveled their snow off their sidewalk, and then you're talking politics, and you know that that person is a good person, even if you disagree. But politics now, so much of the discussion is what you go onto your Facebook page and talk to people who are like you. And you don't go talk to strangers. Now you can't because we're on quarantine. And so you just get the same thing over and over. And the people who speak the loudest get their ideas repeated. And there's, I think, a little bit of a psychological thing that, when the person yells, charge the barricades, almost nobody says, can we have a committee meeting to discuss that first? They charge the barricades because they're whipped up into a frenzy. And I think if we study the video, eventually we'll see a moment where there was a handful of operatives who said now, and the crowd surged into the Capitol building, and why they did this and why the crowd followed will be the matter of a lot of discussion. I would also agree with my colleagues that a big test right now is going to be how the test of the democracy is how the Justice Department responds to this incursion in the Capitol. If the Justice Department cracks down and goes after these people, and we're already seeing videos of it, and not just the Justice Department arresting people. There's one I saw yesterday of a man at the airport who learned he had just been put on the no-fly list as a domestic terrorist, and he couldn't believe it and was going around the airport screaming about it, only proving that he was a domestic terrorist. But also corporations, as my colleague just said, Professor Gupta, firing people and making it clear that this behavior is intolerable for whatever reason they do it. That there is going to be a window of opportunity for the Biden administration to actually, I think, have more success than they would have if January 6th was just a boring day. The 74 million people, and certainly who voted for Trump, and certainly the people at that protest, I think the vast majority of them believe the election was stolen. Even though the evidence in the real world tells them that it isn't, they're not in the real world. And they are angry, but had they not had this riot in the Capitol, I think what would have happened is on January 20th, when Biden was sworn in, he would have faced a divided Congress, the Republican Party coalescing around Mitch McConnell, who had no particular interest in cooperating with the Biden administration. I think the shock to the system of January 6th at least provides an opening. We'll see if it actually lasts more than a week for Republicans who do believe in the rule of law and who have never really liked Trump, but have kept their heads down. People like Ben Sasse from Nebraska, obviously Mitt Romney, to say, okay, we're going to cooperate with the Biden administration. Let's see if we can come up with some basic policies that we can move forward on rather than oppose him at every step of the way. So I think there is a chance that January 6th will turn out to be a horrible moment that also sort of reinvigorated the prospect of the government working together. I'm just reading this great biography of James Baker, and to see James Baker and Don Rostenkowski, this cranky Democratic Paul from Chicago, sit down and negotiate a tax code, about just revising the tax code, which is the hardest thing to do in America, but doing it even though they're on opposite sides of the aisle, being able to cooperate. There's a chance, and I only say a chance, that this could happen after January 6th, that there will be that desire to cooperate. In terms of foreign policy, the biggest thing Joe Biden has to do, whether it's cynical or not, is to reassure the world that the United States is actually committed to everything it's been saying since 1941 about American leadership of alliances, American support for democracy around the world. And he's going to have to convince people that this is real. And most importantly, that this is not going to be a 4-year period where we promise it, but then we go back to Donald Trump or somebody like Donald Trump, and that this is the 4-year of Trump's presidency the aberration, or is this the start of a brand new trend? And in 2024, we're going to elect somebody like Josh Hawley or Ted Cruz, who's going to go back to this Trump world where the United States is in a life or death struggle with other countries, that sees its allies not as allies, but as adversaries who have been ripping us off, as Trump would like to say. And so we're going to see in particular crises. Will the United States be able to get back in with the countries that negotiated the Iran deal? In the last week, Iran announced that it was ramping up the enrichment of uranium to get a lot closer to the ability to make a nuclear weapon. Will the countries who tried to check that welcome the United States back in and find a common policy? We've also have commented, particularly conservatives have commented that the Trump administration has blown its relationship with China, that China has only gained power and influence over the last 4 years, the one thing that Trump said he was against. And so, the Biden administration is going to have to go back to the countries that used to look to the United States for support and say, okay, we're back. And this is why it's going to be more than just a 4-year blip and you're going back to Trump world in 2024. Finally, I work on environmental policy, and I think it'll be particularly important to see if we can do anything about climate change. I know that Joe Biden thinks it's important. He appointed John Kerry, former Secretary of State, to be his point person on climate change, to try to get the United States back into the world community and back into a leadership position on climate change. Again, a lot depends on the Republican opposition in the Senate, because the US government can only do so much via treaty, because any treaty needs to get through the Senate with 2/3 of the Senate's votes. Clearly, they're going to need about half of the Republicans, or at least a third of the Republicans, to get on board with that. And I don't know if he's got the support for that. We know that there are a lot of Republicans in the rank and file, or people who used to call themselves Republicans, who believe that climate change is real and the United States should do something about it. And I think that the challenge for Biden in this particular critical issue, which is probably the most critical foreign policy issue the United States faces if we're looking out 50 years, is to try to find a path that can bring in some of the Republicans who might have interests in the policies, whether it's green energy or particular kinds of ways of generating carbon sequestration, and finding allies among the Republican Party that he can bring together. I have hope that John Kerry can do that. And I think that the United States is going to end up seeing this 4 year of Trump foreign policy as the aberration that has not helped American foreign policy. But so much depends on that core Republican group that voted Republican in the local elections and in the House election, but then voted for Biden. What are they going to do in 4 years? Will they see enough of Biden to switch and vote Democratic in 2024? Or will they say, okay, we got rid of Trump, we can go back to voting for whoever the party nominates? So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And I'll be happy to answer questions after everyone else has spoken to.
Professor Dorsey, thank you very much. This is yet another very interesting analysis about the future of the US foreign policy. One of the points that you made is about the polarization, which is normal. And in fact, when Amit was talking about the demographic transition, in that normal polarization, what is happening is today, I was reading somewhere, the Republican Party is becoming more homogeneous and the Democratic Party is becoming more heterogeneous. Diversity of people part of the Democratic Party. So this kind of polarization is going to influence the politics in coming years. The main point that you raised, whether Trump was an aberration or he's a trend, and there are many allies of the United States, enemies of the United States, which are raising the question whether it was just a 4 year aberration or not. But the fundamental question is this: even if Joe Biden is claiming that he's going to rebuild, it is not going to be a rebuild. It is going to be a new normal. And although he's going to re-engage the allies, the fact remains that RCEP is concluded and TPP is somewhere there in the back burner. And then you have the recent investment treaty between the European Union and China. These two things are going to pose a tremendous amount of challenge to Joe Biden when he wants to go back to the allies, the NATO members, the EU friends, Japan, South Korea, all of them are with China now. Mm-hmm. And those are hard economics and all. That is going to be a fantastic challenge for him. I don't know whether he's going to do it or not. Another point that you touched upon, very, very interesting. I agree with you. Probably the whole world agrees that it was a fair election, no doubt about it. But it really shudders us to think that 147 members of the US Congress sided with Donald Trump, 147. And they wanted to stop the calculation of the electoral vote. And that simply shows that Trump may go, Trumpism may continue for quite some time. Mm-hmm. But anyway, your observations were really fantastic, brilliant. Thank you so much. Now, let us move on to Dr. Roli Lalan.
All right. Thank you. It's really great to see you again, Professor Mahapatra. It's been too long, right?
Yes.
So I want to keep my comments brief because I really do want to hear what questions we also have. But I want to just start off by saying that this recent attack on Congress really shows how divided America is, as the other speakers have also mentioned. It's just incredible how much things have changed in recent decades. It shows the divides between urban and rural America, the wealthy and the poorer, the middle class, also the intellectual and non-intellectual, and all of these divides. Some of these fissures play out together, but other ones do not. I mean, we have people who are wealthy but rural, and intellectual and, living in the middle of America. And so these things have played out in such a way that, yes, it was surprising actually that over 70 million people did in fact vote for President Trump. And I think that for a lot of Americans, that was a surprise. I think after the past 3 or 4 years, a lot of people thought, wow, this is going to be hands down an easy election. It's very clear that Trump was incompetent. Look at these protests that we had with Black Lives Matters and so forth. So I think there was a general feeling of, hey, this is a clear choice. And I think a lot of Americans, it just shows how much Americans don't know, we don't know ourselves, that Americans were actually surprised by this, that they didn't realize that half of the country actually was perfectly happy with the way that things had played out in the last 3 or 4 years. And I thought that surprise in and of itself was a surprise, right? And that's something to look at. And how did our media and technology and so forth play into that lack of information about what is actually going on around us? Several things are leading towards this, I think. One of them is how much America no longer agrees on basic facts and history any longer. We've seen in recent years that politicians have been spending years just providing their own versions of history, of reality. We also see that there's some very basic things that you'll see in other countries there are more agreement on. So for example, whether or not Americans should receive universal health care. Whether or not, how should education be funded? What type of education should Americans be receiving? It's not as though all of Americans are saying, yes, we all need to have, universal health care. And then there's, oh, we don't have enough money or something like that. It's that there are fundamental differences on how the economic system should work. And what's also fascinating about this is that many Trump supporters who would benefit from a lot of these policies still feel that these policies are not going to help them. And unfortunately, this leads to a spiral because a lot of the benefits and education benefits and economic benefits that could actually help rural and poorer parts of America that actually supported Trump are not in many ways supported by this constituent group. So there are all of these issues that are economic and political. Then you also have a broader social identity issue. So we don't really have agreement, and we have in fact less agreement over time about whether or not the US should have a political identity or an ethnic identity. Now I would say, I remember in the 1970s, there was always this really, it was a very strong emphasis on America as a melting pot. So there was a conceptual basis for America as an immigrant nation. It's a melting pot. You take everybody, you mix it together, everyone takes a little piece and we're all happy. Not that it was perfect even in the 70s or 80s, but it's a conceptual framework for where we are going as an identity. Traditionally, everyone knows that the US is not an ethnic nation the way that France would be or something like that, or Japan. Because we all moved here, basically. Now, that has played out even more in this past year when you see things like the Black Lives Matter movement coming to the fore, and a lot of Americans, especially Trump supporters, saying, well, but why do we need to care about this? This is not part of the national identity that we have constructed in our minds. This is not part of our nation. Our nation in our minds is a white nation. It's a white Christian nation. And that concept itself needs to be addressed. And I would say that in many ways, that was one of the larger failures of President Trump during his term, is in not unifying the nation with an identity. In that sense, I would say other Republicans like George Bush, the George Bushes, both of them were far more unifying in that sense in terms of a national identity, So I'd say that Trump really kind of took that in the wrong direction very strongly. In addition with that, looking at the issue of immigration on the Mexican border, and how to deal with humans in general, incarcerating children and families at the border and things like that. So this whole concept of, there is just this, technically a white nation and everybody else doesn't really fit. Now, I would say that in many ways, the rise of the internet and social media just turbocharged this trend. And what we're seeing is that, as a couple of the speakers mentioned, people are seeing these echo chambers, that they're seeing their own views reflected around them in their Facebook groups and Twitter feeds and in the channels they choose. And again, this is a technological change that it is significant in the last few decades. Because again, there was a time where everyone had to watch NBC and CBS, So every night your news used to be the same news as everyone else saw. And so we all agreed that this is what happened yesterday. But now, when you have someone watching, I've forgotten the name of the new Trump television stations, but one of those stations or Fox News versus another station, people actually have a different version of events of what happened. And that, so technology and internet and media has all had a sort of magnifying effect in these. And then what's fascinating about this as well is that the government, by emphasizing and continuing to emphasize the need for free speech over civil dialogue, has meant that technology companies have by default become responsible for moderating speech. And it just really shows in many ways that the government has dropped the ball. And so what we currently now have is a race to the bottom in terms of political dialogue. Who can, because if you're really looking for likes and shares, then what you need to be more radical. Studies have shown that moderate speech on the internet does not get you the likes and the shares. You have to say something truly crazy, and so what we're seeing is really this race to the bottom, trying to get these likes. And the last few months, I have actually been spending strangely on Parler, the extreme right-wing, space online, because I've been tracking QAnon. And I have to say, it's truly scary. Okay, so you have a large group of people in America who really do believe that the elections were faked, that Democrats are child-killing kidnappers. They believe that George Floyd's murder was a fake. It was just a prop, and that the protests were paid for by George Soros. It's a conspiracy, and none of this is real. You actually have a significant number of Americans that believe this, They also believe that the Pope and the Dalai Lama are all part of this conspiracy. So if you have the Pope Francis now coming out with a moderating statement saying, no, everyone calm down, be reasonable. Well, you have a whole faction of people saying, no, he's part of the conspiracy, So it's hard for Americans to understand how strong this is, because when people last week said, well, who could have seen this coming? Well, I've been reading Parler for months. Oh, believe me, I saw it coming. They were very, very clear. The attack, get your military gear together. Here's our guns, we're going. And so they're very, very blatant about this. So these are things that are all going to make everything difficult for Biden as he steps in to his new role. And there are people who obviously don't believe he won the election. They believe he's not a valid president. He's going to have to convince them. We have 45% of Republicans in a recent poll saying that the attack on Congress was valid, that it's something that was probably okay. So he's going to have to win them over. In terms of foreign policy, what's fascinating is that Trump's approach to COVID actually had, I think, a very, very detrimental effect on our foreign policy, in the sense that there was attacks on, the China virus. There's all this type of thing, and the whole idea that the rest of the world, is mistaken in their approach, and that we're fine, even though we now have more than 300,000 people dead. So in general, other countries will look at our COVID response and say, well, that's pretty darn incompetent, and that is largely because of the divisions again. So Trump strongly said, you know, masks not needed. We don't need to have social distancing. This isn't really any worse than the flu. And so there was a political basis for the failures in COVID policy. And other countries can see this and say, well, you know, what kind of incompetence are we dealing with here? So there, COVID, and there's Iran and the Iran nuclear deal, and the fact that the Europeans were saying, well, after we spend all this time hammering all this out, you're going to ditch us and run. You're going to cut and run. Great, you know. So the Europeans were not happy about this, and this is not going to play out well. In Biden is going to have to rebuild bridges and also convince people that, hey, if we make a deal, we're going to stick with it. How can he say that? We don't have a track record at this point. China, as others have mentioned, our relations have deteriorated, but not only that, yes, we have ceded the global stage to a large extent. A lot of countries are moving towards China right now and saying that, well, China is carrying a lot more of the cards. China seems more sensible. China seems more dependable. There are a lot of reasons why people are turning towards China right now. And then, of course, Mexico, Trump largely, insulted and berated the Mexicans. So Biden's going to have to work on the border issues there. And an interesting one is India. Actually Trump had a very good relationship with Hindu nationalists. And so this is going to be fascinating to see how that plays out in India with US-India relations. I know that many Hindu nationalists were actually rooting for Trump to win the election, and they're quite disappointed that Biden won. So now Biden has to deal with the fact that he is now working with sort of a nationalist contingent in India that doesn't agree with all of his policies. And I think that he's going to have to work on that, and we'll see how that plays out. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation, Dr. Roli Lal. You brought about so many important points for all of us, but I'm tempted to say one or two things on your observations, very nice observations on Indo-US. You know, Trump had good relationship with India. Obama had good relationship with India. Bill Clinton came to India to shake hand after 1998 nuclear test. And then George Bush enhanced it further into strategic partnership. So I think Joe Biden will also do the same thing, and the bipartisan support to Indo-US relationship will continue. But the main point that you made is actually related to post-truth, which Rand Corporation has brought out so many studies on post-truth. There is a very thin line of difference between fact and fiction. And one of the reasons why a large number of people who support Trump are able to parade their own views through the social media and make people believe the kind of truth they think are true, this is dangerous because social media is uncontrollable. Any individual sitting anywhere can make a news. You don't have to read only New York Times and Washington Post and Chicago Tribune and all that. So the social media is a big source of news, completely uncontrollable. And at the same time, the point again you made, you see, Donald Trump was not invulnerable to the coronavirus. But now, more than coronavirus, the tech companies have the last word. They removed Trump's account from Twitter and Facebook. That shows the most powerful person in the world, can be punished by two companies, Facebook and Twitter. That is a very, very new development. And the healthcare point that you said, 40 million plus Americans don't have, health insurance, right? Now, pandemic is a big lesson to every individual everywhere in the world. I mean, this is where you cannot make any compromise. One guy having the virus can pose a threat to the entire society. So here, your insurance, non-insurance is not going to work, right? So that is why health security is going to be very important for Joe Biden in next 4 years or so. But anyway, another last point, you talked about the melting pot. I think ultimately the United States could not be the melting pot, but a salad bowl. Earlier, before Trump, there was good salad dressing. But right now, it is very uncomfortable coexistence between different kind of items in the salad bowl. And that is where the identity politics is going to play out, and things are really uncertain in the future. But your points of view are remarkable. Now, let's move on to Professor David Lubin. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here today to discuss some of the very serious challenges faced in the US. First of all, I'd note the current pace of deaths in the US due to coronavirus is over 3,000 a day, and we are currently on track to hit 400,000 deaths due to COVID before Trump leaves office, which is a stunning record into itself. The current political crisis focuses, of course, on President Trump's really unheard of denial of the validity of the election results, which is something simply no past leader of the United States has ever engaged in, or major party nominee who's lost from either side. And moreover, this big lie has been supported by 2/3 of House Republicans and 9 Senate Republicans. And he's convinced large numbers of Republicans in the general population. He's incited violence and an insurrection against a fellow branch of government, resulting, I don't think we should forget, in the death of 5 people, including a Capitol police officer. So this is quite a stunning record. The deeper problems beyond the event of the past week are that this is part of a long-term trajectory in the fraying of democracy in the US. And so the question is, will this be a turning point back towards trying to improve the situation, or is this just a blip as we continue on this negative trajectory? The signs in many ways are not encouraging. Trump or his successors will continue to inflame matters after his departure. The country and Congress are so divided that it makes it difficult to accomplish much. And our entire system is based on compromise due to the separation of powers, which anticipates even if one party controls both the Senate, the House, and the presidency, that they will be jealous of each other and not always work so well together. And in general, to pass anything, some bipartisan support usually makes it much easier, and that's been virtually impossible to accomplish. Outside the halls of power, right-wing extremism is now a major danger and clearly increasingly organized and willing to be violent, and been egged on by the president. I would add that the increasing stridency that, while in no way is really comparable to what is happening on the right, still creates problems that the increasingly intransigent left can play into it also by eschewing compromise, which again is how our system is fundamentally designed to work. And that the increasingly sort of the presentation by the left of President Biden's agenda as sort of a milquetoast weakness is rather stunning, considering he ran on the most liberal platform of any presidential candidate in my lifetime. And with all respect to my colleague, Bernie Sanders has now been rejected twice by the own party that he claims support from, and running on his agenda, and yet his supporters seem to believe firmly that it is quite popular despite the absence of any real evidence to support this. And the reality of American politics is that identity divisions currently trump class divisions in the US, and the ability to mobilize sort of white working class voters based on a working class agenda has been a dream of sort of left wingers that seems ever more far from the ability to do this. Another problem facing the US is that I think people are quite right in thinking that we could benefit potentially from reforms that would potentially allow a greater diversity of parties to emerge. In the past, the way this happened was that our parties were really quite big tent events that had much greater range of viewpoints within them. Okay, but now they are increasingly like parliamentary parties that vote together, and so that sort of diversity within the parties is increasingly vanished and making that sort of bridging compromise difficult. Electoral reforms that might promote either depolarization or a plurality of views to emerge are very difficult to adopt in our system, though it's interesting to see that the state of Alaska has now adopted a reform that I really think is an excellent idea and maybe others should look at. I will say that one sign for optimism, however, has been promoted by actually a conservative in this case, who's a never Trumper, George Will, who aptly pointed out on several occasions that sometimes things have to get worse before that they can get better. And that in this case, the worse may have been a salutary moment in waking up the country, in that it both divided the Republicans and the Trump supporters and has placed the Democrats on the offensive. In terms of foreign policy, others have highlighted the challenge. What I would notice that the challenges that the United States are facing is similar to challenges posed by illiberal, populist, right-wing parties around the world, okay? And that we see this in countries, in democracies everywhere around the globe, from Turkey to India to Hungary to Poland, France, the UK, and the US. Okay, so this is hardly a unique phenomena. Okay, but in the US, it's perhaps a particular challenge because we have only two parties and one has been captured by essentially this illiberal populist right-wing movement. And that essentially this prevents a real problem. Obviously, it's going to be used against US efforts to promote democracy and human rights and peaceful transitions elsewhere. It also weighs heavily on the trustworthiness of the United States as a partner. What I would conclude by saying simply is that what I think all of this shows is this, is that once again, the United States has been provided with a reminder that democracy is not like a train arriving at a station. Okay, it's not like one day you get there and you are a democracy and you are done, finished, democracy accomplished, yay. Okay, but that democracy is an ongoing journey that requires nurturing and support for liberal democratic values across generations. What's perhaps most disappointing in some ways about watching this is I don't know that history repeats itself, but the failure to learn from history certainly leads to perhaps depressing outcomes, in that it's striking to me how supportive so many people are today of ideologies that are linked to the great failed ideologies of the 20th century, namely fascism and sort of socialism in its original Marxist format is tried out in places from the Soviet Union to China to Venezuela and onward without success. And that I would say sort of the liberal center and gradual progress have become greatly underrated in our society. And that sort of quiet, and that in fact, much of the gains that many countries have made, from South Korea to India to Taiwan, have occurred in this matter. And while maybe occasionally punctuated by dramatic moments, the lifting out of people out of poverty and the accomplishment of providing more meaningful opportunity and meaningful sharing of the wealth generated by society tends to occur in this manner. And so I hope maybe that the sort of center, be it center left, center right, becomes more revitalized at some point. And on that note, I'd simply like to thank all of you again for having me here today. And I look forward now to hearing from our last speaker.
David Lublin, thank you so much. There are pearls of wisdom in your brief remarks. And you ended with a positive note about how democracy is actually a journey and not a station to be arrived at. It is an ongoing thing. There will be ups and downs in every country, including in the United States of America. And actually, there are silver lining in this dark cloud of the Republican Party. There are many people who think that the Republican Party may be divided. It's not going to be divided. There is going to be a race among the leaders as to how to set it up. And when Donald Trump talks to the Secretary of State in Georgia and says, I need 11,000 plus votes, and he says, sorry, no, that was a silver lining. When he tells his own vice president, look, you have to reject this counting of electoral votes, and Pence said, sorry. Then look at the Senate Majority Leader, how he handled it. Initially, he was with Trump, and later he distanced himself. So within the party, there are leaders who are pretty serious about keeping the party intact, give a new direction. It should not be Trump and the rest. So things are going to change, and that's a wonderful piece of wisdom. And thank you so much for your presentation. Let's now move on to our last speaker, Dr. Namrata Goswami. Namrata, who is yours?
Thank you, Professor Mahapatra, and it's a pleasure to be here again. I was here once before the elections, and I said at the time that my hope is that American democratic institutions are capable of handling the Trump era. I must say that what happened in the last few days has increased my optimism, because as Professor Mahapatra said, the democratic institutions held despite the pressure from a sitting president. The counting was done. The president-elect was certified. And so those are very positive signs. Now, I think the fact that we have a lot of audience from South and Southeast Asia, I think the fact is that the election this time was not even close. So if you look at the electoral college votes, Biden and Harris actually received 306 electoral college votes, and Trump and Pence received 232. So I think for the audience, it's important to realize that this is not a close election as Trump is claiming it to be. The election that was actually close was in 2000, where George W. Bush got 271 electoral votes and Al Gore won 267 votes. That's a close election. And the other important fundamental point is that in the American political system, legal challenges are legitimate. So you can have a legal challenge to a particular election, but once the process is over, including a statement from the Supreme Court, you then concede an election, as Al Gore did on December 12, 2000, when he conceded the election. The difference this time is that there has been no concession from President Trump. And I think that is the fundamental structural reason why we are seeing what we saw today. January 6th, to my mind, had two important implications for me. One was, of course, the shock at seeing that a crowd of rioting protesters were able to enter the Capitol without being stopped. The second point was more personal, because in September 2019, I was actually in the Senate building along with pro-democracy activists from Hong Kong, talking about the importance of democratic reform in Hong Kong. And January 6th, to my absolute dismay, saw the arrest of 53 Hong Kong pro-democracy activists. So January 6th really stands out in that particular context. Now, given the questions that have been posed, I will address them in order. So one is that, why did this happen and why did this come about? I think the critical point is that there are structural and there are other reasons why this occurred. Some of my previous speakers have talked about it. I think President Trump's role in fomenting the violent rioting in the US Capitol is without doubt. If you listen to his speech just before the protesters went to the Capitol Hill, he was talking about how we need to stop this process, a legal process, How do we need to actually protest in a way that the counting doesn't happen, putting pressure on Vice President Pence? If you listen to the words used, and I'll talk about that a bit later. The other important point is that these particular conversations on social media were amplified by other influences of a particular political ideology. And so you did have the construction of a case that what they were doing was right. And that is why I think it's important for us people who study social phenomenon to critically understand. But I think it's important that we do not get caught in episodic analysis. So we need to go a bit more long term. And I think I am not really surprised by why it happened, because if you listen to the construction of a narrative, there was the construction that the mail-in ballots are going to be illegal, that non-citizens are voting in this election, the election system is rigged. This has been continuous for the last 1 year. So the fact that there were so many millions of American citizens willing to actually accept such a discourse is because of the fact that they had access to very different amplifying points and different social media conversations. Now, the other important point, which I think get lost, is that there is also a threat to media in this particular conversation. Because if you remember, Trump kept amplifying the point that mainstream media is a democratic propaganda machine. And so if the fourth estate, which is one of the upholders of democracy, is viewed by a section of American citizens as bias and not giving you objective facts, that can create a social system and belief system that there is something wrong with the entire structure of democracy itself. Now, many people point out that there is some kind of comparison, especially from the other side, that there was the questioning of Trump's legitimacy in 2016, especially after Clinton lost. But the important point is that Hillary Clinton conceded. And so that is the difference from what happened today and what happened then. Now, what are the root causes of this particular incident and all the conversations we've been hearing for the last 4 years? As someone studying conflicts for the last 20 years, including the cause of violent conflict in areas like Northeast India, I cannot help but look at the literature of why do men and women rebel. Detgard tells us that it's because you fear a sense of relative deprivation. Democracy, after all, is about representation of who is going to be in power. It's about power, and power means certain policies, certain values that are going to be forwarded. And so there is a section of the population in the United States, including the state I live in, Alabama, that thinks that there is a tussle between globalist and nativist ideologies, where globalists are going to open up America and the nativists, especially those from uneducated, poor background, are going to lose out. So there is this particular conversation happening, which is really important to understand. I think the second important root cause, I'm not talking about President Trump here. I'm talking about what led to this particular phenomenon. And that is, there is a genuine fear of loss of identity, and that this is very ethnicity or very tribal based identity formations. So there is a concern that a particular group, which is probably a majority, as Amit was pointing out, is going to lose out in the America that's going to come in the next 20, 30 years. And that does lead to the kind of fear and anxiety that we are seeing. Now, there is also economic hardship in America. And so that also has led to the kind of conversation. And what is very interesting is that Paul Collier's analysis becomes very relevant here. So if you look at the age group that's actually going out to the streets and did what they did, it's between the age of 20 and 35. And that's the age group that is most susceptible to the kind of conversations that we see today. And the more people you have in that age group that feel themselves out of power, lack of representation, lack of a particular value system that they have inherited or adhere to, you'll have more such protests and violent rioting in the next few years. Now, the important point again is the unprecedented role of social media. Now, I woke up to the impact of social media not on January 6th, but actually in 2014, when there was a particular monk in Burma who called himself the Burmese Bin Laden, who used Facebook and Twitter to incite extreme violence against Rohingyas. And that was the day I realized that social media could be for good, which President Obama used very well for a democratic, conversation and community organization, which Indian former Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj used to reach out to Indian citizens. But that's the good part. You also have that part, but it can be used to incite violence. And more importantly, it can be used to incite violence and genocide. And yet those posts were not taken down. It was only taken down in 2018, posts that actually incited violence. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, look at their use of social media. So we who are social scientists, you need to realize that this particular phenomenon is going to stay, and this is not new. In fact, what is so ironic is that I was reading this particular book by Carl Sagan, written in 1995, called The Demon Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. So Sagan, there's a paragraph that he writes that he tells us about the danger of these 30-second bites and very small conversations. And don't forget, he's written in 1995. And he said that because of this very short bites that are becoming very critical in public discourse, it'll lead to a dumbing down of critical thinking and skeptical thinking. How right he was. In fact, I was rereading his book today and I was like, wow, that's very prophetic and deep understanding of how societies actually run. Now, there are some history lessons as well, which we need to remember. And in fact, in an article in the Huffington Post in 2016, I had written that one of the important history lessons is that when people feel unrepresented, which happened in Rome. So in Rome, when the citizenry did not feel included, especially those without land, you had demagogues like Tiberius Gracchus who championed themselves as standing for those people who were disenfranchised, and then actually did illegal terms and illegal extension of power. You had Julius Caesar, who refused to give up power and go back to becoming a civilian. And of course, we know what happened to Rome. You had his grandson, Augustus, who actually removed Republican Rome and established Imperial Rome in the context because by saying that there are people within Rome who were not represented. And the American Republic is very much inspired by the Roman Republic. We heard that in speeches in the Senate just after January 6th, which was inspiring to me to hear. And so you need to think that this is not something that is a new phenomenon. Human societies, representative structures have been destroyed because of what the structural conditions led to. Now, coming to the question, and I'll end with that, is what are Joe Biden's challenges now? He's going to be inaugurated as the duly legitimate president on January 6th, but he does have challenges. One, I think it's Biden's challenge to restore faith and rebuild the destruction caused by the Trump administration in American political institutions. And that's not going to be easy, but I think he will have to do that. He will have to restore faith that the American electoral system, despite its imperfection, still delivered a resounding success in terms of having people participate in the democratic process. I think he'll also have to understand the impact wrought by social media. And so especially as Carl Sagan pointed out, to understand what has happened in terms of belief system. And that is where international relations theory comes in, constructivism. Constructivism, they tell us that social reality is constructed. You have hardcore fact, and then you have constructed belief systems that actually influences how people think. And so this is what is happening here. You have different constructions of reality that different pools of population are looking at. I think it's extremely critical for President Joe Biden to create a bipartisan group announcing the sanctity of the elections. And this is critical to counter the false propaganda that these elections were rigged or that some people who were not qualified to vote voted. People think it's not important. We need to not engage in that. But I think it's critical because you do have American citizens who think that the election was rigged. So you need to have a policy response to that particular propaganda. Now, the fallout internationally and in terms of foreign policy, I was so interested to see how China responded to this particular event. And as predictable, China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in a briefing indicated that the American democratic system is hypocritical. Because on the one hand, when Hong Kong protesters violated the Hong Kong legislature and burned down and destroyed structures, the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, said that that's a beautiful thing. But then when it happened to the US Capitol, the response was very different. So it's very fascinating how they are constructing this discourse. And now they are using terms like insurrectionist, rioters, violent protesters, people who are not Chinese citizens who need to be arrested. So you can see that already China is starting to take advantage of what happened here. The Global Times editor-in-chief published an editorial yesterday, which says that a battle is happening in the United States, and this is not the Civil War that happened at Lincoln's time. This is actually a civil war on the internet, and it's going to continue. It's going to divide American society, and his words are, the United States is at a crossroads over where the US will go next. Now, this is the most important and ironic point that he makes, and that is the US freedom of speech may be redefining itself, or perhaps it's true, implications are about to reveal itself today. That is, the voices politically bolstering me and willing to stand with me should be fully free, while those opposite to me when it comes to politics and ideology should be restricted to secure them at a disadvantage. Isn't it ironic that this is the editor-in-chief of a state-funded outlet that's talking about concepts like freedom of speech? And I think that's going to be Biden's challenge. How do you counter such propaganda and restore faith in the American democratic system? I think David pointed out COVID-19 is going to continue remaining a challenge. I checked the data today, 22 million Americans have been infected, 383,000 deaths, and that's going to continue to be a challenge as to how do you register the vaccine. There has been extreme chaos in how the vaccine has been put out to American citizens. There is confusion, and that has to be dealt with. The other point is the economy. And finally, I would say systemic racism. That's one of the points that both Biden and Harris pointed out in their speeches. How do you actually do it in such a way that it does not create this countervailing force that we see, especially as Rolly pointed out. I also joined Parler because I'm a conflict researcher to see what the conversations are happening there, because I don't want to be disinformed. And it's actually not very pretty. The kind of conversations that I'm seeing, it feels threatening, but it's important to realize that this can actually burst out. Now, I'll end by saying, which has been oft repeated, but I just went back to that speech again by Benjamin Franklin, where when he was asked by a group of citizens when he came out of the Constitutional Convention, that what kind of government have you created? He said, a republic if you can keep it. But he also, and what is so ironic is that he pointed out at the time that the new America is very divided. There's a huge anxiety among the citizens that it could lead to violence, it could lead to civil war, it could lead to differences. But if you can manage to deal with those issues, you will continue remaining a republic. And I think those are wise words that today seem so relevant. I think I'll end there, and thank you so much.
That was a very nice presentation, Namrata. Very comprehensive, theoretical, conceptual, empirical, current affairs analysis, all put together. Really, I enjoyed your presentation. One or two takeaways from your remarkable presentation on social media. Social media and democracy, both are like, imagine they're like weapons, dual use. It can be used, it can be misused or abused. Like, for example, when a terrorist organization is using social media to recruit the terrorists, then it becomes negative. And the same social media can be a way of communicating with the people directly. The leaders don't have to depend on TV networks and some mainstream newspapers to communicate with the people. Through the social media, they can directly communicate with the people. There's a positive side of it. Likewise, democracy. You can have democracy in countries like India and the US and Britain and France and all. But look, through democratic means, what happened in Algeria? The Salvation Army came to power. What happened in Hamas? Hamas coming to power through elections. So the same means can be used, misused, abused. So there are so many nuances, and we have to be careful about it. So your one point I would like to respond to the Chinese view on this. Hong Kong and Congress. In Hong Kong, people barged into their institution to protect democracy, which was eroding fast and which was being controlled by Beijing. Whereas in US Congress, it was just opposite, right? So there is no comparison between the two. China is saying civil war in the internet. It is because of China. Look how Trump dealt with Xiaomi. Look how the Russians are, hacking even in important departments, including intelligence department of the U.S. government. So it is not internal civil war through the use of internet. It is international war. So, but all your points were very well taken, very nice. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions to our panelists. All the presentations are really brilliant. So, Dr. Pramod, if you can ask somebody to read out the questions, then we can go around and they can respond.
Sure, so there are very few questions. First is on Facebook, which I have said. Did this attack will affect American democracy or her stance on democracy? And second is, what circumstances will Biden face in future to counter Trumpism or divided America? Third is, could the latest stunts by the soon-to-exit President Trump somehow lead to a revision of the powers granted to the present US President in the near future? And the last is, can Twitter's permanent deletion of Trump's account be seen as the reflection of the fact that the US political system and stability has invisible actors that safeguard the democratic regime? I think these are the questions. Maybe everyone can respond. And
there can be a seminar on each one of the questions, right? But even then, we should have brief observations from the main paper presenters on those questions. You can pick up the question and respond depending on you. So shall we go in the same order or the reverse order? Let's go in the reverse order this time, maybe. Namrata, can you respond briefly to any of the questions?
Yes, I'm just trying to decide which one be seen as a reflection of the US political culture, has invisible actors. Well, I think my fundamental point would be that, do these attacks affect American democracy or her stance on democracy? I do not think in the long structural fundamental sense, American democracy is going to get weaker. I think it's going to strengthen because of what happened. I think it is critical to realize that it's not that we did not have conversations about the impact of what Trump was trying to do, the conversations that he was trying to put forward, instigating, riots and protests, creating a false narrative of rig election. There was enough warning and conversations that we actually engaged in. I remember myself taking part in such conversations. So I think I do not see this particular rioting leading to a weakening of American democratic structure. And I'll end with this, and I mentioned this before, that American political institution structures are based on a fundamental, critical, foundational structure, which is separation of power. So it is important that the founding fathers understood human nature, and it's a very realist understanding of human nature that if power is given without restrictions and foundational constraints, it could lead to corruption. And so the American political system, as you see from January 6th, has held. Even despite the fact that they tried to stop the electoral certification, it happened even in the night. So in that context, in my view, I think the institutional structure of American democracy actually showed its power. And I think what Trump failed to realize is that the institutions of American democracy are fundamentally sound, and he now has to face the consequences of what happened. So I would end with that.
Right. Professor Lublin?
I guess will it change the US stance on democracy? Not at least under President Biden, and I think the renewed focus on some of these issues will lead to maybe tensions with some people who got on well with President Trump, though the US can also interface with these countries on a variety of other issues. For example, while Prime Minister Modi and President Trump got along very well, India and the US continue to have a fundamental set of issues on which I think, they both share profound interests that go beyond simply the relationship between one leader and another. And while President Biden and Prime Minister Modi may have a different sort of relationship. I think they will both continue to work to advance the interests of our two nations, for example. But so I don't see us becoming sort of negative on democracy. If anything, I see a reversal of sort of President Trump on that. I will say people like me who occasionally at the behest of the State Department have traveled abroad to talk about democracy and promote it. Part of our job in some ways is to show humility about the United States on it. I think we're going to have to, if these sorts of programs re-engage, the level of humility is going to have to increase greatly.
All right. Thank you so much. Dr. Roli Lal.
Thanks. I think I'll take two that are connected in one shot. One from Dr. Burak on Twitter's deletion of Trump's account, and one from Arman Mehta on what mechanism can we non-politicians attempt to use to decouple politicians from the benefits of supporting extremism. So I think that both of these questions kind of point to one of the strengths that we've seen in the aftermath of this attack on the Capitol, which is that private sector really stepped in. And what we see is that the private sector, it has its own interests, and the interest is to make more money. And the fact of the matter is, a strong and stable democracy that upholds the system that we have had in America, not the one that Trump wants, that the system that we have had is what really supports the growth of business. And they know that. And so we saw the National Association of Manufacturers come out against Trump. We see chambers of commerce. We see all the big companies saying, hey, back down, you did not win this election. We see, Twitter, Facebook, and Google all come out and say, we're banning Parler, we're banning Trump, whatever, So I think that what we've really seen is I wouldn't call it an invisible actor that is being, orchestrated from anyone in particular. I would say it's more along the lines of this is the force of globalization, the force of the economic system that is coming in on the side of democracy. And I think in that sense, what normal citizens can do is to help reinforce that by saying to companies, by saying to businesses, hey, this is what we believe in. We expect you to uphold these values. We're going to, vote with our dollars basically on this. If your company is going to support these political crazies, then we're not going to support your company. And I think that in that sense, because our political system is so heavily funded by businesses and PACs, it will make a difference.
All right, Professor Dorsey.
Thank you. I can take the question about presidential powers. It seems to me that there are two reasons why the presidency has the power it has now. One is what's structurally in the Constitution, and that's definitely not going to change. There won't be any successful process to amend the powers of the presidency in the Constitution. But the other thing is that the Congress has largely abdicated power. For instance, basic things like the old idea of declaring war in an act of Congress. We have resolutions to support the use of military force, but Congress has backed away. Somebody mentioned George Will earlier. One of George Will's drumbeats over the last really 20 years, but certainly during the Trump administration, has been that Congress has allowed the president to take so much power, not just the president, but the entire executive branch, to pass a general law and then let the executive branch come up with all these regulations that Congress has no oversight over. I do think that somebody like Mitch McConnell generally supports the idea of a stronger Congress. He would like to have more power. He, I'm sure, anticipates being back in the majority soon, given it's a 50-50 Senate split. So I think that the one place where the presidency could be trimmed is that Congress could reassert a lot of its inertia that it had sort of given up. If we just look at the budget process, that was one news story about a week before the big eruption of January 6th, it was the fact that Congress had been unable to produce a budget and just sort of crammed everything into a continuing resolution, which it's done for about, 10, 20 years in a row now. It's just, the actual process of governing in Congress is broken down, and that's allowed the executive branch to have so much more power. And so I don't, Joe Biden doesn't seem like the guy who is going to organize a more powerful executive branch. And he's certainly not going to hand power over. But because he was a product of the US Senate, I think there's a chance that the Senate in particular will become more powerful, and by that, constrict some of the power of the presidency itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Amit?
Okay, 3 quick points. 1, Biden has to come up with a new Marshall Plan to combat China's BRI, China's RCEP, and China's comprehensive agreement on investments with the EU. 2, leadership. After 9/11, George Bush went to the biggest mosque in Washington, D.C. and said, this is not a war against Islam, this is a war against terrorism. And he actually told the FBI to try and protect Muslim groups across the country. Lots of isolated cases of violence, but no mass riots against Muslims in areas like Michigan, New York, so on. Biden is an institutionalist. Biden will let American institutions work, and Biden will not go out and encourage extreme elements. Okay? And that is good leadership, because if the leader says, I condemn, grassroots can't do anything. Third thing, and this is for David Lublin, you don't understand Bernie Sanders and you don't understand what happened. So let me educate you. 1, a lot of Bernie's agenda became the agenda of the Democratic Party in 2020. 2, you don't have to win, you have to influence. And nobody's sitting there going, oh, he didn't win, bankrupt ideas, etc. But the third one's the interesting one. Biden's going to be 82. So, you know, there are very few countries in the world which support gerontocracies, and I don't think the US is going to do that in 2024. Kamala Harris is, to most Americans, unimaginative. The person you should look at, and believe me, is going to get a lot of grassroots support, is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who will be 35 in 2024. I'll end with that.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, a couple of quick points. So I just, two of which really go back to two of my main points at the very beginning of this really interesting forum. So again, I just want to reiterate what Professor Lublin said about the importance of humility around future U.S. Democracy promotion. Again, this was sort of my major third point from my talk. I mean, I think that the U.S. really can only resume its work on behalf of democratic values with much more or much less hubris and much more of a spirit of collaboration. And actually, a lot of my work is a critique of sort of the hubris of past democracy promotion efforts. On the question of hidden forces of helping American democracy, you know, Twitter, et cetera. So I very much agree with Dr. Lal's point or points around, you know, the pros and cons of corporate involvement. I mean, I don't think that U.S. democracy generally can be trusted to be promoted by or generally is promoted by corporate interests, although sometimes that happens. So again, this goes back to my point that I think what's really worth studying is the way in which citizens and officials generally are responsible for and, you know, don't often really work to push for or hold accountable norms around the rule of law and democracy. You know, so this informal stuff that did to some extent work recently is really, I mean, these aren't, you know, hidden forces of democracy, but they're really where a lot of contestation happens and needs to happen. I didn't, you know, I didn't get to talk about the Middle East, which, you know, I sort of made the strategic decision not to, but I just did want to say one quick thing. I mean, you know, like most of the panelists, I'm no fan of President Trump and what he's done. But one interesting thing is that the recent move that his people have done to de-escalate, to help de-escalate the the dispute among Gulf countries, which of course Trump actually helped create in the first place, is interesting. And I mean, I think we're going to be in a moment in the Middle East where um, countries, sort of these dominant Gulf countries plus Israel, working more openly together, I mean, isn't going to be necessarily good for international justice, or, certainly not for Palestinians. But it's going to be an interesting new pressure point against Iran, and it'll set Biden up in a way for the ability to push back some, not only against Iran, but against kind of China and Russia's engagement in the region. So it is interesting to see what's going to happen in the Middle East, and it's what maybe the one area in which I give Trump a lot of critiques for what he's done, but a minor amount of credit for the situation moving forward. Thank you.
Very nice. Distinguished panelists and ladies and gentlemen, the event of 6th of January would not have happened but for President Donald Trump. He talked about the voting fraud even during the 2016 election. And even after winning the election, he said there was a voting fraud, otherwise he could have got more votes. He kept on talking about the voting fraud during the 2020 election campaigns. And there was an impression that if he would win, there would be no fraud. If he would lose, 100% there would be election fraud. He opposed the voting by mails. He opposed the early voting. He asked the Proud Boys in a presidential debate watched around the world, stand by, stand up and stand by. And then he supported the people who opposed the Black Lives Matter movement openly and did not condemn those who unleashed violence on some of the members of the movement. And he and his supporters filed so many cases saying that there was voting fraud. Then he called the Secretary of State in Georgia and said, help me 11,000 plus votes. He urged his own vice president to help him. Then he told the Republican members not to count the votes. Now, hours before, the congressmen and the senators were supposed to calculate, ceremonial counting of the votes. He makes a speech openly and he says, come on, let's go and do something about it. Fight like hell to win. Imagine the American president saying that, and his own lawyer saying the resolution has to be through combat, Giuliani and all. And then you have 147 senators and congressmen who are supporting him. Now the big question is, what is going to happen on 20th of January? All of us are nicely talking about what happened, what may happen, what may not happen. But Donald Trump is still around, and his supporters are still around. We do not know what is going to happen on 20th of January. There have been so many surprises in world history, but this president is different. When the defense secretaries, including those who worked for the Republican presidents, openly and unitedly said there could be a military coup in the USA. Oh my God, unimaginable, military coup in the USA. So let us keep our fingers crossed and wait until 20th of January. After 20th of January, if things are okay, we will wish Happy New Year to all of you. But it was a wonderful event. All of us, I think, made some good points. Questions were brilliant. And I'm sure what I said in the beginning, we learned a lot from this. Now, Pramod, your closing remarks.
Professor Chintamani Mahapatra, Professor David McNuff, Dr. Amit Gupta, Professor Kirk Dorsey, Dr. Rodi Lal, Professor David Lublin, and Dr. Narmata Goswami. And dear participants, it's my distinct privilege to propose a vote of thanks to such a distinguished panelist. We are very grateful to have Professor Chintamani Mahapatra for chairing the session and moderating such an interesting session on an important theme. We are really in-depth to all our speakers for their valuable time and interesting observation. We'd like to thank each one of you for your support and encouragement. To all of us, It was really an interesting discussion. We could not have much better panel than this. We really learned a lot, and I'm sure our participants have benefited immensely from the discussion. We wish to have you all in future, maybe when Biden completes 100 days at his office. We are also thankful to all our participants for their questions, interesting questions. Before 20th January, let me wish you all Happy New Year 2021. Have a nice day to all our scholars in US, and good night to our participants from Asia. Thank you so much for your presence. Good night.